Alright, so this is going to start out my go-through of all of my Criterion Collection discs, and that's going to, I haven't been going for a complete spine collection as some people have, and those collections are truly epic, but I started picking up more than I originally intended to, so if at some point I do hit that magic complete spine collection, yeah, it'd be great. I haven't done it on DVD or Blu-ray, of course, and I certainly don't have the finances to do so. But the Criterion Laserdiscs are just incredibly done, and they birthed many things we now take for granted, such as the special features, supplemental audio commentaries, you name it. And many have never re-entered the Criterion Collection and thus remained Laserdisc exclusive. And in addition to that, a good number of them have very exclusive technical qualities and various transfer notes and differences that have not carried over to later editions. Many have transfer differences that make the Criterion disc not only collectible but historically important as well. And that goes without saying that the Criterion features and commentaries don't necessarily always carry over to later Criterion and non-Criterion releases. So that's another reason why they're highly prized, very collectible, and you should hang on to them if you have any. So we're going to go in spine order. Now again, this is not a complete Criterion Laserdisc video, as that would take a very long time, and I have nowhere near the amazing collections as other Laserdisc enthusiasts. But I'm going to get started with it's not exactly a Criterion title, but it is a Voyager title, and so it's almost the identical rear jacket to a normal Criterion disc. But it's such a wonderful release that I couldn't pass it up when it popped up. This is the Voyager release of For All Mankind, the famous documentary that essentially chronicles the early space race and the history of the Apollo missions. Beautiful jacket, beautiful photography, wonderfully printed with the Voyager label just printed across, and it just is a wonderful looking release. A little crease damage, but not bad. This is the harder to find CAV version, so it is a gatefold with a supplemental features section. Here's what the gatefold looks like. It's very, very well done, with original photographs and actual quotes from the people involved. Here's the second panel. So again, not exceptionally rare or anything, but just not common, and just a beautifully put together release for a very important document of an extremely significant part of our history. Again, this is CAV encoded across 2 discs. The documentary feature goes through side 3, and that's where the supplemental features pick up. And then it runs on to the entirety of side 4. I believe it has a mixture of NASA footage from the time period, and I can't remember exactly if there's also maybe some outtakes from the actual documentary itself, but it's just a really nicely done package. The rear jacket is done up almost exactly like a regular Criterion release, right down to the same icons and typeface and everything. It would be a Criterion release, except it just came out on the Voyager label, and this is a 1989 release. It does have a digital soundtrack with Dolby Surround encoding, which sounds lovely. I believe this has come out, at least I'm pretty sure it's come out on DVD since. I don't know if all these old features carried over, but still, just something I never really intended to pick up, but it just popped up, and it is the CAV version. And with Criterion and Voyager discs, you always want to shoot for the CAV version to get all the supplemental features and the slightly better video quality, instead of being stuck with the CLV version, which most of the time would be a reissue disc without the features, slimmed down to a more affordable CLV package, and of course usually denoted by the spine number with an A coming after it. So again, just a nice release. Technically not a Criterion, but I thought it's a good place to start since it is a Voyager release. Now here you have a really nice one, and there's a multitude of these, so this gets confusing on which one you're talking about. Spine number 2, the CLV reissue disc of King Kong, course, King Kong is the second film that Criterion actually ever released. It was one of the original 2 titles, Citizen Kane being number 1, that came out in the now famous and highly collectible silver boxes that of course, use this same cover artwork image, but has the now very famous silver Criterion box, and also had CLV issues. What's interesting about this is it is a later pressing, so it's a bit better in pressing quality as opposed to the earlier silver CLV disc. I'm already getting myself tongue-tied. But what's nice about this is it actually includes the audio commentary. And the running audio commentary for King Kong is the first one that was ever actually recorded. So that's what makes the Criterion Kong so important. And I was actually quite surprised that this disc actually is very, very nice. I figured it wouldn't compare very well to the older CAV silver one or the later kind of more cleaned up discs that you could get from Image, or the double feature with Son of Kong, and then of course the restored DVDs and the restored Blu-ray. Of course, in talking about restorations and Kong itself, you have to realize that for a very long time, Kong was severely compromised in 2 different ways. Of course, it was originally released in 1933, which was before the production code was really heavily enforced, which started the next year in 1934. So, of course, when seen in its original 1933 uncut version, there's scenes that certainly would have never gotten past the production code. And so I think it was a 1938 reissue. And this happened to a lot of other films as well, especially a lot of the early horror films and gangster films. For reissues, they had to be submitted before the production code and then cut to and conformed to the code doctrines. So Kong very famously lost many scenes of violence from the rampage attack on the escape from Skull Island, when all the villagers and various crewmen are killed, and very famously, Kong crushes one guy into the ground with his foot. There are other shots, famously in the New York rampage, the moment where Kong picks up the subway elevated train, that was cut out. There were just numerous pieces all over the place that were just lost. And it wasn't until the 70s that they were found on a 16 millimeter reduction print, and then literally just duped and spliced into 35 millimeter prints. So when you would then see it in theaters or on television airings, if you saw one of these cobbled together new prints, it would suddenly go to this very grainy, very beat up, doopy 16 millimeter footage, but with all the violent stuff in, and you got really excited because you got to see all of the nasty parts that you hadn't seen ever before, probably, unless you saw the original 1933 release. So when Criterion licensed it, and this uses the same transfer as the silver sets, that's what they were stuck with. So when you watch this or any of the other Criterion discs, you're going to run into the fact that you're going to notice the quality drops off all of a sudden for all of those little pieces, and that's really the reason why. When they came around to do the DVD, sometime in the interim, around 2005 or so, they found a duplicate British negative that had been just sitting in a vault and was almost pristine over in the UK, and that was actually, that had never been submitted for censoring, and it had all of the bits that were cut out of the original film in the 30s for the reissue still intact. So that's been used for the DVD and the Blu-ray ever since, and it's absolutely gorgeous. This is never going to hit that same level of quality. That being said, it's a very important document in terms of home video history, and I just really love this packaging. I love the design on the black cover background. I love the usage of red text. The liner notes are just fantastic, and you still get the Ronald Haver running commentary, which of course is also very historically important, and it's a really good listen. And you get fun little bits like we've never tried this before, so you're gonna hear the movie audio, and I'll try not to talk over it too much. It's this. Just pretend like I'm talking to you. It's gonna be a running audio commentary. So it's kind of funny hearing them trying to explain the concept of them actually doing a video commentary for the first time. Of course, this is an early Criterion disc, so this is before they adopted digital sound, so it is analog only. And again, the source itself was compromised, so it can be a bit hissy, and it's going to be, dependent on how good your player is at, playing back analog audio. Some are better than others. That being said, it's an extremely enjoyable watch, even on this CLV disc. It just made me fall in love with the film all over again. And there's a little subversive part of me that still really enjoys seeing this cobbled together version, with all of the violent stuff being kind of degraded, just because I'm that guy that still misses going to, run down art houses and seeing whatever battered print came from studios. I like to see stuff that, you're just not going to see in this modern digital pristine age sometimes. And it's just fun to do detective work. So it's just a really nice disc, and you can pick up one of these CLVs for much cheaper than the older CAV boxes, and you get the commentary, so that's nice. Most of the time the CLV disc will lose all the CAV features. So that's important to note. And again, there's a multitude of different pressing runs on this. The earlier original editions that are very collectible will have the silver boxes and the silver jackets in both CAV and CLV form. But the CLV here is no slouch, and again, because it's pressed a little bit later, in about, I think this is from 87 or so, usually that's a little indicative that they're going to be a bit better pressed, because I know some people have had issues with some of these silver discs having some rot tendencies, so that's another thing to note. But beautiful release, beautiful packaging, and last but not least, there is one little tweak that happened on the HD Master on the Blu-ray, which is otherwise just astonishing looking. Some of the armatures for the stop motion puppets that are just were and still are revolutionary. If you were to freeze frame the film in any version prior to the HD Master, there are some frames, particularly I think it's around the pterodactyl attack on the cliffside, where there are a handful of frames where the actual armatures are still there. It's just like either a goof or it was left in as an in-joke, but I'm pretty sure it was probably just a goof. It's only a frame or two, but those have actually been removed on the HD Master, I presume digitally. There's an originaltrilogy.com thread that alerted me to that, because I had no idea. I didn't think they'd made any changes, but just so you're aware, there are a handful of extremely minor changes that have been made in King Kong. So, detective work will always get you somewhere. So, beautiful release. Of course, it was later supplanted by the Image releases that eventually added a digital soundtrack. And if I remember correctly, they had a commentary of their own as well. Here's another great release that was a silver release and was later released on one of these CLV black jacketed discs. This is Spy Number 5, The Third Man, directed by Carol Reed, and easily by far and large one of the greatest motion pictures ever made. Now, very straightforward jacket, and this is kind of showing you where they were eventually going to go by having a particular color background, the Criterion logo and a bar up here, a various frame grab from the film or a publicity still kind of boxed in a almost widescreen aspect, and then the title just rendered in a very nice but simplistic font with the other smaller Criterion logo down here in the bottom somewhere. There's a number of discs that kind of follow this pattern. Of course, mostly things like the British Hitchcock films that made it to the early Criterion spine numbers, and a few other things like that. But this kind of shows you where they're going and how quickly they're already getting to their kind of standardizing of their packaging. Of course, the reissue King Kong disc also has that similar pattern, but it has a much bigger artwork rendering of Kong than just a square image. Again, beautiful liner notes, analog sound only, but it's a really nice transfer, and it's pretty much just a reissuing of the early silver box version that was the original issue. No special features, sadly, and this is really the only good release of the film in the States on the format. I think there's a Japanese release from later that added a digital soundtrack, but pretty much this is what you had until you either got the Well, pretty much until you got the Criterion DVD in about 2001, and that added a good amount of special features. And then, of course, Criterion later issued it in 2006-2007 as a 2-disc DVD and simultaneous Blu-ray issue with new features added and a brand new transfer. Of course, that Blu-ray has long been out of print and fetches ridiculous prices on eBay. Studio Canal did another Blu-ray, which was okay, but not as good as the Criterion, and both of which have audio tracks that have been a bit too overscrubbed in terms of dynamic range. So the old Criterion DVD is actually better in terms of dynamics. And the film has had a 4K restoration, which looks fantastic. I've seen it theatrically as a 4K DCP, and it's just, it'll blow your socks off if you've never seen it. And that's come out on Blu-ray in Europe. You can get it from the UK, France, and I think Germany as well. They're all region free, if I'm remembering correctly, and you can import those for very, very cheap. It has a couple new features, and of course none of the Criterion features from the DVDs and Blu-ray. And the audio track seems good, but I haven't had a chance to do a full-on comparison. So anyway, that's out there if you're interested in later editions of the film. But as far as Laserdisc is concerned, this and the original silver box release is what you're going to be looking for, unless you're going for, all the various Japanese releases of classic titles. Because there's a lot that came out early on Laserdisc that only had analog sound here, came out later in Japan with digital soundtracks, but I don't know as to the quality of the print source they may have used. So not really a necessary release, but if you're going for completion or you're as big of a fan of the film as I am, it's just essential. And these discs usually pop up for very cheap. Most of the time people are going after the silver box originals. Now here's a really, really nice one that's really not too common. It took me quite a while to track down this. This is the CAV, spine number 7 of High Noon. And I was actually really happy to track this down. It has a couple exclusive extras, and if you find it, you usually find the CLV version that is, of course, extra less. And I think this was really one of the first titles they did where they did more than just, a single commentary. And of course, this has digital sound. It's not an analog only disc, and it's only spine number 7. But you can see how they're getting even closer to the cover they used on the cover design they used on most of their titles. So a nice image from the film, although I probably would have gone personally with the more famous shot of Gary Cooper standing at high noon on the town street. That was pretty much used on all the DVDs and such. But still, it looks very nice, and the brown kind of goes with the period setting of the film, although it is in black and white. You do get a nice gatefold because it is a 2-disc set. A nice image chosen from that, climactic showdown, so at least you do get physical representation of that. In terms of the other panel, you just get a cast and crew listing. And then, but what's really helpful is you get an outline of the, it's listed as an audio essay on audio track 2. And it's listed as an 80-minute essay, and the film's, of course, only 83 minutes. So it's essentially a audio commentary, but in the form of a spoken essay. And here it's broken down into chapters, kind of outlining what each chapter, what the talking points are, and it's actually bulleted out so you can kind of follow along or find a particular passage again if you're looking for it later on. Now here's the rear cover. Again, good amount of liner notes, and then you get the much more familiar looking Criterion block of information with the production credits, and then the identifier that it is on CAV. You do get a supplemental section at the end of the side 3 after the film ends, and it's essentially some text slides with information about cast and crew, and then a little bit about Carl Foreman and the film's production during the era of the Blacklist and its connections to the Red Scare and HUAC hearings, and how many people consider it an allegory for HUAC and the entire Red Scare inside of a Western. So again, landmark Western, really nice release. The transfer itself is actually pretty good. For a long time, this film had kind of iffy rights, and so it came out in a lot of editions that were very washed out looking. I remember the first DVD looked really, really crummy. So I was very happy to find this, and the mono soundtrack is PCM and sounds very lovely. Of course, it's now been restored in 4K, and there's a beautiful reissue signature version from Olive on Blu-ray, so definitely pick that up. It has some features of its own, but for completion's sake, you pick this up for the extras and to have the best version on Laserdisc. Now here's an extremely important one, and it was recently announced and confirmed this will be coming out on Criterion Blu-ray, finally rejoining the collection. This is spine number 9, the CAV version of the Magnificent Ambersons. Of course, Ambersons also came out in one of the original silver sets, just like High Noon, forgot to mention that. And this one's really, really well done in terms of the packaging. It's very simple and straightforward, looks like any other Criterion disc, but the coloring is actually this beautiful, ornate silver, almost a platinum of sorts. And the picture still from the film is printed in a way that it comes across as very glossy, and it actually has some deep silvery black quality to it, which is really, really nice. Of course, this has a little wear and tear on it, as these are likely to get, but this is very, very hard to come by and can get very pricey, so I was more than happy to find a copy. The other thing is this pressing is actually pretty prone to rot. Most copies you're going to pick up will have some speckling here and there, but this is the only way to get all of the extra features and commentary and such for the film. And on the new Criterion Blu-ray, I don't know if all of this stuff is going to port over. I'm sure it will for the most part, outside of the text information, which is probably going to be surpassed by what's on there. I know it's already going to have a new commentary. I know that's been confirmed. I don't know if anything else is going to be added. Well, I'm sure they'll do some new video pieces. But anyway, it's still just a really, really nice piece to have, and it's got a lovely gatefold as well. So again, the platinum coloring carries over. Here you have an original one sheet for the film printed, and it's, again, these are very, very, very well printed. A very glossy, very deep black in terms of the print quality. So top-notch job on the packaging as usual, even though it's just a simple gatefold. You can tell, at least a bit more time, care, and attention to detail went into this reissue disc of Ambersons. Here you have the chapter breakdown, and then it goes into the supplemental section on side 3. It's basically, for the most part, it's a lot of text screens and then a lot of description about the removed and deleted sequences and about the studio reshoots by others. And then the analog track 2 contains the commentary, and then it also, during the supplemental section, has, if I remember correctly, it has the entire Mercury Theater on the Air adaptation of Ambersons that was done a couple years before the film was made in 1942. Again, beautiful text notes. The standard Criterion jacket has appeared in its full form, and as you can see, it's almost identical to the High Noon one. Robert Carringer writes the liner notes and also records the commentary, so that's nice that you can kind of link the two because it's the same person. And just a wonderful, wonderful release. The only downsides to this are that it can be rot prone. Luckily, my copy here does not have any rot issues, and I've watched it several times over the past couple years, and I think the only thing I've noticed is one side maybe has a few speckles at the very start when it's still on black leader frame. So nothing really major. But the transfer itself is absolutely beautiful. It's beautiful to look at. It's beautifully encoded for CRT screens, and it really gets across the photography style that Wells tried to establish with Stanley Cortez, and it's just one of the best black and white transfers out there on Laserdisc, I think. And it's so good in the CAV encoding that even when Warner Brothers finally put it out on DVD, even with DVD's advancements, that was like a single layer quick disc, and yeah, it was from a better source, but I always just came back to this because this just felt a little more authentic than that, even though it wasn't technically as good. The new Blu-ray is from a new scan. It should surpass everything, but this one will really give you a very authentic feel. Now, it is an analog only disc, which is unfortunate, and I don't know why they did that, because High Noon had a digital track, and that's 2 spines ahead, but of course they didn't really go in spine production order all the time, and they kind of went back and forth on what titles had digital sound and what didn't, and it's like they flip-flop for a while. I don't know why, but me being a Laserdisc PCM nerd, and that's what got me hooked into the format for the first time, I really regret, having to go back to analog, which is totally fine and is great, and the track on this is just fine. But I just really wish it had a digital track. So again, wonderful release, and stay tuned for the Criterion Blu-ray. But speaking of digital sound, I was finally able to pick this up, and I really wanted to. I think Criterion realized their mistake, because they started reissuing some titles a couple years later in updated CLV issues. So here is the 1993 Spine 9A repressing of the Magnificent Ambersons with new artwork, although it uses the same cover image. And you can see it has the updated Criterion black bar across the top. So again, it is quite a bit newer in terms of the Criterion lifespan on Laserdisc. I will admit, I do like the cover. It's a nice design, but it is I don't really know if the red goes with the black and white, but it does work. I was just really happy to finally find this, because this adds a digital PCM rendering of the mono, and this disc also does not have any rot issues, so you can pick this up if you can actually find one and be without the issues of the CAV version. However, you're going to lose all of the supplemental section, but it does maintain the Robert Carringer audio commentary. And the liner notes are pretty much, I believe it's the same as the CAV, if I remember correctly. I think it's pretty much the same liner notes, so you just get an updated package, but you lose the supplemental section on the CAV version. But this disc is really, really hard to come by, and it usually goes for relatively high prices just because of its rarity. I don't think they press too many of these, and that seems to be the common factor for a lot of these later like CLV reissues that were just, I guess, run in limited quantities because people were requesting it and they couldn't get the other one. And of course, being later, they added digital sound. So the PCM is really the bonus of getting this, or the real reason to get it. And of course, this was all before it was finally confirmed that it's coming to Blu-ray. So a really, really nice piece, not a common disc, but I just had to have it for completion's sake and for the digital audio. Here we are with Spine 13, Black Orpheus, which is a really, really nice cover, and one of the few that departs from the single color background look. Just gives you a real sense of the time period, place, and setting. And again, this one isn't too common to find the CAV version. Usually you just find the single disc CLV release. There's a lovely gatefold with the essay inside, basically talking about the film score and its relation to Greek mythology and how that was kind of transposed onto a completely different setting. I do like the white background, and the photos are well chosen. It makes me think of an old school soundtrack LP release, really, because a lot of those would have various writers or PR men write a long piece about the soundtrack itself or the composer or both. And so it just really gave me that vibe in terms of how the pictures were chosen and how it was laid out on a white background with a very, very well written essay piece. Or maybe that's just me, but that's just the first thing I thought of. Now here's the rear, again with the standard Criterion design firmly in place. I believe it has some supplemental, or is this one of the ones? Yeah, this is one of the ones that it doesn't really have a supplemental section. So the bonus on this is going to be having the CAV encoding. So the film's spread across 4 sides instead of 2 sides, and you get the nice gatefold. So again, just a really nice release. Again, not too common, and I've only seen the CLV version once before, so even that one doesn't seem to be too common. Again, you get the digital sound marker up here, and that's the easiest indicator whether you're looking at something online or in a store and you wonder if it has digital sound or not. If you can find this little marker somewhere on the jacket on the back, that means you're good to go in terms of it having a digital track. It'd be different colors and located in different places, but that's what you're going to want to be looking for. And of course, you can always cross-reference with the Laserdisc database. Now here we get to one of my earliest Criterion finds, one of my all-time favorite Criterion discs, and the way I watch this film every single year. This is spine number 18. This is the CAV box set of It's a Wonderful Life. Now, admittedly, this is a little banged up, and it has this hole punched through it. So I just found it when I got started into collecting Laserdisc, and I had known that I had gotten the newer Paramount DVD. It had finally gotten a new studio release, and I knew that they had kind of just reworked some old stuff, and the transfer wasn't the greatest, and there had been some degraining that went on, and they kept putting out the colorized version as well, which is an abomination and should have never happened and should be literally destroyed and never seen again. But anyway, I digress. So I was very curious to pick this up. It has an exclusive audio commentary, which is a very, very good listen. And again, you see it's the standard Criterion artwork style, but it uses an approximation of the film's original typeface from the poster. I love the red and white, which totally gives off the vibe of the holidays without being too overdone, so it's extremely classy. And of course, the film image is perfectly chosen. You could have chosen almost any shot from this film, and it would have been perfect for the box cover. Let me show you the rear. You know, if this was a CLV or just normal gatefold, it would be just like any other Criterion release, but it's enough disc because the film's longer to warrant a box set. Some really good liner notes also by Janine Basinger, who does the audio commentary, and knew Frank Capra and has written many, many, many important good articles and books on Capra. So she is absolutely the perfect person to discuss It's a Wonderful Life. So if you haven't heard this commentary, it's absolutely recommended. You do get a small supplemental section that has some publicity stills, some on-set photographs, some materials about the making of the film in the form of text slides, and then most importantly, it goes into I believe it's an AFI seminar from the 70s with Frank Capra, where he's talking to a bunch of students about his own personal tenets of filmmaking and his own ideals and what he always strove for and how different his ideals were from the way the industry had changed at that point in time. So it's a really, really, really gripping interview piece. Whether you're a Capra fan or not, or just a fan of this film, it's absolutely recommended to just watch that little supplemental bit, because it's just words and thoughts and ideals like that are not going to come around ever again, probably. But so anyway, I digress, but I'm going to open this up. The discs are just slotted in here, but you do get the lovely usual Criterion insert letter, which is still one of my favorite things to have in one of these box sets, to have the original Criterion letter that, you know, says write with any comments, and it talks about the film, and then it goes into technical notes, which is my favorite part. So I'm going to read you this. So the materials used was the fine grain nitrate print struck from the original negative that was stored at the UCLA archive. And it goes on to mention, since the film is in black and white, optimum viewing will likely be with the color level on your TV or monitor turned all the way down. Set brightness controls high enough to bring out as much of the rich detail in the film as possible, but not so high that you begin to wash out the more subtly shaded areas. Of course, at that point in time, this was before most people had even really thought of getting test patterns or, you know, Video Standard, Video Essentials. This really kind of predates consumer test discs. That would really be more in the professional domain or for disc mastering. So it was really nice to have small notes like that, and then have the Criterion inclusion of color bars to kind of give you a frame of reference for what your TV should be set at. And of course, this is all referring to old school CRTs. consumer CRTs, not professional ones, so you had less options and only a few knobs with very little control. So of course you can kind of ignore that at this point in time. And it explains about the supplemental section and how some older players aren't good with the text stops. And then the running commentary on audio too. This is another analog-only disc, much to my chagrin, and analog track 1 has the original mono, and track 2 has the commentary. I wish to an exorbitant amount that it did get a issue with the digital track, because the transfer is the real reason why I keep coming back to this disc. The disc labels themselves are custom, as are most, but unlike a lot of others which just use a standard Criterion design like this does, this actually uses the red and white from the cover, so that's just a nice touch. Not all Criterion discs kept the same color and design from the packaging, but this is one that does. Of course, it is spread across 5 sides, so it can be a bit more difficult to watch than most normal movies on CLV or even shorter films on CAV, but the side breaks are well done and they aren't intrusive, so that's fine. But the real reason why I love this so much is if you ever get the chance to see a 35mm print at a revival screening or an art house, they still do it yearly at a lot of theaters as a tradition, and Paramount I don't think has made a high-res DCP available. If you see a 35mm print of this film, it looks identical to this. Some of the same damage marks that were on here are on the last print that I saw, and I was so happy because this saying that it came from a fine grain right off the negative, that's going to be the best available element that all of the printed materials were either struck from on later releases, and that's going to be what's available from the studio. And of course the rights changed hands for a good amount of years, so there was a while where the film was unseeable, and that's why PBS stations and public access stations started showing the film and turned it into such a classic tradition. So eventually Republic Pictures wound up with the rights and started doing their own Laserdisc, and they did their own master off of seemingly the same source. And if you compare, it started out as an analog only disc, and they did the lovely looking 45th anniversary version, which I showed on my regular videos. It added a small documentary, which has been recycled on all the other releases, but the transfer is noticeably kind of more washed out looking, but it does have a digital PCM soundtrack. So you do get the benefit of PCM, and it's CLV, so it's only on 4 sides on 2 discs. And then they did a last Laserdisc release, which seemed to recycle the early 90s 45th one with maybe some better encoding, and then that got transferred to DVD. So there's a decent DVD that looks like the original version from Republic that you can still pick up. Paramount got the rights a little later and put their DVD out in 2006, and that's where their new master that looked a little sharper and looked great on DVD, but was kind of degrained and kind of they took out too much of the grain. There's some frozen grain issues, and the HD master and Blu-ray just kind of bumped that to 1080p and kind of revealed all the flaws. And it only has a lossy Dolby Digital version of the mono that even has some pops and ticks in it. So if you really want to see the film properly, I would actually, and I'll absolutely say it, if you can't see it in 35mm in an actual theater with an audience, and it still works perfectly just as the day it was made, pick up the Criterion CFA box scene right here. It's one of my all-time favorite Criterion titles. The transfer is fantastic. It has an exclusive commentary. The interview piece is absolutely wonderful, so the extras are all exclusive. You can get it for very little money. The artwork is beautiful. I just wish it had a digital soundtrack. But the transfer of this, as far as I'm concerned, is the best home video release in terms of picture quality the film currently has. It looks identical to the 35mm prints you can still see in theaters. So highly recommended, essential Criterion title for more reasons than one. Here's spine number 22. This is another black cover analog only issue. This is Hitchcock Sabotage, one of the more famous of his British period, and another one that Criterion was fortunately able to get the rights to. The film was kind of considered public domain for a very long time. So until it got a DVD release from MGM here in the States in about 2008 or so, as part of the really problematic Premiere collection that was defective when it was originally released. Until that DVD release, this was the only decent version of the film really available, because you were stuck with all these crappy public domain copies with bad, shoddy prints, and 99.99% of them were garbage. I think the first time I saw a decent print of this was a Canadian VHS public domain release, and I really had a hard time as a kid trying to see a lot of these in watchable ways. But I always knew tracking down the old Criterion disc, although they were really older discs without any special features, was at least the one good solid way to see the 3 or 4 of the titles they actually released. So again, you have the standard Criterion packaging already intact. They keep with the black cover, red text, and gray Criterion banner. Of course, this film cannot come highly recommended enough, even though Hitchcock himself admitted that he made a dreadful mistake in letting a suspense sequence go too far. Hitchcock fans know exactly what I'm talking about, but if you've never seen the film, I don't want to go into it. Most websites or Hitchcock books will spoil it right off the bat, but it's an extremely effective sequence that is actually quite dark for a 1936 film. But his entire British period, all the British films in that particular output are noticeably, a bit grittier than most other films of that time period. There's definitely a sort of pre-code flavor to them in a lot of ways, even though they were made in Britain and they had different constraints than the films under the code did here. That's just sort of the vibe I've always gotten from these. And starting with The Man Who Knew Too Much in 1934 is when he really hit his stride in the sound period. So pretty much every film from Man Who Knew Too Much up till Jamaica Inn, which was his final film when he left Britain, pretty much all of them are classics in their own right, even the flawed ones. So really nice release. Simple liner notes. I wish it had a commentary or some special features. There's a little smattering of special features on the MGM DVD release, and it's now out on Blu-ray in the UK from Network. I think it's included in the Hitchcock series that's been various titles that have been restored and remastered over time, and they've been leaking out in Europe first and very, very, very slowly trickling out over here. We've only gotten a handful. So hopefully somebody steps up and actually does not just one or the more important or more well-known ones, but does all of them, because even though Hitchcock is still a household name, people's knowledge of his other films and his less famous ones, particularly the British films, is dreadfully lacking, because these are extremely important, and from both an artistic standpoint, a historical standpoint, for Hitchcock nerds and studying his career, but they're also just some of the greatest films ever made. Continuing with that, here is spine number 23. This is the Criterion release of Secret Agent. This film is definitely lesser known and even lesser well regarded in the Hitchcock canon, but besides being a Hitchcock nerd, I'm a giant spy nerd, and this is definitely one of the first really great, dark, dramatic spy films. It's definitely a big contrast when you compare it to The 39 Steps, which is a great escapist adventure film and really kind of set that entire mold for every film that ever followed. This film is in sharp contrast and is a really, really interesting piece of work, even if it doesn't always fire on all cylinders. Now, again, it has almost the identical design as Sabotage, except they have changed the typeface for the actual title of the film. So it's very nice, and it goes well and then kind of linking these releases together. I kind of like how they did this for a while, so it's kind of like a follow-up to the classic first 9 and the silver boxes. Show you the rear. Again, no special features, but you get a nice text essay and the chapter breakdown. Another nice image from the film. So again, like Sabotage, for a long while, this was the only decent release of Secret Agent you could get anywhere, because everything else was a crappy public domain copy and literally looked and sounded like garbage. And of course, you never knew if it actually had the whole film or we would be missing chunks. So again, a really nice, important release. if I'm remembering correctly, you can now get this on various UK and European DVDs. I can't remember exactly if it's already come out on Blu-ray overseas, but here in America, there's no decent release of it outside of this Criterion release. So if you're here in the States and you have no region-free capability, this is still about the best way to actually enjoy this classic film. And it, again, is an analog-only disc with no special features, sadly. Now here's a very important one, still going with Hitchcock. This is spine number 45A. Most people know the big CLV box set of this film, but this CLV reissue is also extremely important. I'm of course talking about the Criterion release of North by Northwest, one of the indisputable classics in the Hitchcock canon, one of the greatest films ever made. And if you've never seen it, do so immediately, because what have you been doing with your life? But anyway, it uses the same artwork kind of commissioned for the CIV box, which takes the absolutely breathtaking, famous crop duster sequence and transposes it with the finale of that sequence in a really nice fashion, I think. For one of these Laserdisc collage covers where they take different pieces of the film and do like a early version of Photoshop, kind of bringing them together, I think this works really well. And it's nice to see it across the full Laserdisc jacket. Now the CAV version is a nice big blue box, packaged just like the other Criterion regular boxes, and it has a small supplemental section at the end that isn't replicated here. However, it's an analog-only disc. It doesn't have a digital soundtrack, which is kind of surprising. And the really important thing about this Criterion release is it has its own exclusive transfer with the film's original mono mix, which has been pretty much missing ever since the days of Laserdisc. It's been replaced by a 5.1 remix, much as Vertigo had that happen during its restoration after they discovered the original stereo session tapes of Bernard Herrmann's scores. They built new 5.1 multi-channel tracks around the score in stereo. And in terms of North by Northwest, just like Vertigo, but this one is never talked about, it really undoes the film's mix. The film was, of course, shot in VistaVision, but it was done over at MGM, who did this as a favor to Hitchcock, who liked the format because he'd used it at Paramount for a good number of years and wanted to do it, to bring that over and some of the same crew and just shoot it, but do it as this picture for MGM, who he had to deal with. So MGM let him do that. But VistaVision could either show films with a Perspecta kind of faux surround track. It was a methodology of having a kind of very limited surround track that was generated with a decoder box and had to be steered around the auditorium using a variety of test tones, sometimes with a live control operator. But for the most part, they were shown mono, like most everything was in that day and age. So North by Northwest, from all information, was mixed and shown entirely in mono. And the mono mix completely destroys the 5.1. It's so much better for the film, it suits it so much better, and the music is no longer overpowering. It's mixed in properly. Even though it is one of Herrmann's greatest scores and one of the great scores in the cinematic canon, it's really much better used in the mono mix, which sadly has been unavailable since the days of Laserdisc. Criterion also did their own transfer, which has its own aspect ratio. They went with about a 1.75 to 1, and VistaVision was a variable aspect ratio system. You could frame it roughly anywhere between the European standard of 1.66 to 1 up to about at least even a 2.0 to 1. If you go by the old VistaVision technical data sheets and information sheets, which are all available online, you can look all this stuff up at the American Cinema. You can look all this stuff up at the American Widescreen Museum website, which is a beautiful, incredible resource. I highly recommend you check it out if you haven't before. And you can look at their section on VistaVision, which is really one of the all-time great film processes. But anyway, North by Northwest is presented in various different ratios according to who mastered it and what their preferences are. So MGM later did their own transfer for the CLV release they did, and it's a much more cleaned up transfer. It's a little sharper, but it's got a different color timing and different ratio. It's framed a little more open at a 1.66, and it looks really, really good. It might be my overall favorite image transfer for the film, just for the ratio and the fact that it's a bit sharper than the Criterion, as most MGM discs, when they would do a new transfer later on after getting a title back from Criterion, their disc would be a little bit noticeably sharper, simply from having usually better equipment and more technical resources, more money to spend, so on and so forth. And it also has the mono mix, but they did the same thing they did on Goldfinger, where they replaced the opening title with the stereo version. So you have to keep that in mind. The only way to hear the film's opening title with its original mono mix is still the Criterion release. So again, it's kind of a myriad of versions you're going to have to go through in order to simply try and have the film's original presentation. And that's not to say the new HD version is bad. The new remaster is absolutely beautiful. It was, an 8K scan of the film's VistaVision negative. It looks absolutely gorgeous, but some of the color timing to me seems a bit strange. And again, it still has that 5.1 remix and does not include the original mono, and has a different framing, so you're going to have to kind of compare and contrast all the different versions. So this release has a really, really nice gatefold. It has a few quotes from Hitchcock on the side, and then it has some has a still from the film and a really nice caricature. And then across the gatefold is the original storyboard representation of Roger Thornhill running from the crop duster, which is just a beautiful touch. And I love the way this is laid out and designed. I love everything about this gatefold. It's extremely classy and suits the film extraordinarily well. And here you have a preview program of the film, so that would have been from the original press materials, and you can see the design is really quite unlike all the other printed posters at the time. Show you the rear cover, which is a standard Criterion design, but I do kind of like the color they went with. It has this really, really nice essay, which I believe is also the same one that's on the back of the CAV box. So again, you lose the supplemental section from the CAV box set, but you do gain the all-important mono mix in digital PCM. So that's really the reason why you're going to want to pick this up if you have the CAV box, or if you don't. It's not a very common disc to find. Again, like most of these that Criterion put out in the CLV version, it would either have a whole lot of copies made and thus is very common, or not too much. This isn't exceptionally rare or anything, but I don't see it pop up that often. I usually see the box set version pop up a lot more. And I've been meaning to pick it up, but usually every time I find one, it's beat to crap for some reason. Probably just due to being such a well-loved film, and would have been pulled out a lot, and especially in film classes. Which of course should still do that, and they don't because they're stupid. But anyhow, really, really, really great title from Criterion, and a really important release simply due to having such an exclusive and very different transfer. So I absolutely recommend picking this up. Also do pick up the MGM disc, because it's going to be a bit stronger in the transfer department, but you'll still need this to have the original opening title in mono and as PCM. So you'll really need the box set for the special features and the transfer in CAV, this for the mono mix in PCM, and then the MGM version for its transfer and the mono PCM, but with the stereo opening title. And then of course Lowry Digital did the version that came out on DVD, and that's a bit overprocessed and has really kind of weird color timing that makes everything kind of look pinkish at times. We were stuck with that for a long time with the 5.1 remix. And then the new HD restoration is really extraordinary, but it's got a few quirks and also does not have the mono mix. So absolutely essential there. This is Spine 48. This is one that's not exactly essential, but I just couldn't pass it up. This is Antonioni's Blow Up. A really nice looking cover, and kind of a departure, because here, as you can see, they've actually put a image in the color background to kind of break it up, and then you have various photographs of some of the models from the film put into the title, which is a really, really nice touch. And they've kind of gone for this interesting mix of the kind of lavender lilac with the Criterion banner box in this off green, and a really nice image chosen from the film. So it's a really nice and striking cover design, most use a variant of the original poster, which just has pretty much this image, but in black and white, but with a red background, which is immediately more striking. But this is kind of subdued, and I really like it. At first, I was kind of like, it looks a little strange, but I really actually like it now. So this is the more deluxe version with a beautiful gatefold depicting some of the actual blown up images from the central sequence of the film, and that's eventually what drives, what plot there is forward. And I like how they placed it over a picture of kind of a grassy hill, which is where these were taken. So it's kind of like they're just left laying in that particular hill, which is a nice cheeky touch, I thought. I like any time there's a gatefold where it represents the film and it's not just on a generic blank background. You get a nice text essay about the film here. Now it is spread across 4 sides. This is the CAV version. The CLV is out there and much more common. This has a couple special features. It pretty much just has the theatrical trailer and then the short story that kind of inspired the film in text credits, and then a couple more text slides with some production information and photographs. So it's not really an essential Criterion CAV version, but if you find the CAV and can get it for cheap versus the CLV, why wouldn't you? So again, not a major important release, but the reason why most people want the various versions to blow up is the opened up 133 discs that are out there. I think MGM put those out. I think it's on DVD and VHS tape. And I also think one of the MGM Laserdiscs was opened up. It's essentially an open matted version of the film, and it does show some additional nudity and other things that was... it's unknown whether it was intended to be seen or not. There's several scenes in Blow Up that have been censored on original release prints and were censored in various areas and even censored on the Warner Brothers DVD for some unknown reason. The film was rather notorious for the amount of barriers it broke down in terms of artistic freedom, and even though it was really primarily an art film and sold for art house theaters and the college crowd, a lot of other people wound up seeing Blow Up either on its original release or in the immediate thereafter due to the notoriety it gained. So again, the MGM versions, you can occasionally find one that's a 133 opened up version. I don't know if it's entirely an open mat, but if you look online, there's some screen comparisons that show you that some additional information is revealed. But do keep in mind the DVD from Warner Brothers is actually censored in the infamous tryst with the models. And if you've ever seen the film or even know what it is, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. So the film is available in HD untouched finally, and of course it's untouched on Laserdisc. This is a really nice release. It's not fancy though. Again, it just has a small supplemental section with the theatrical trailer and then the original short story that inspired the film, and then a bit more text slides on the film's photography style. No other special features, but it's a nice release, and even though it is an earlier Criterion without anything else really going for it, it's a different looking package of an important, well-known art house title. And so it's nice to actually see it in its first really good major release that's also letterboxed. Here we go with spine number 50. This is Renoir's The Rules of the Game. This is the full CAV version. There's a CLV version out there that has the identical cover image. I think it's just a different color on the front. Here they actually added a sticker to the cover advertising the fact that Peter Bogdanovich gives a commentary on audio track 2. I don't think they very commonly did that. I was kind of surprised to see that at first. I thought it was on the plastic, but this isn't in plastic, and it's actually a sticker placed on by either Criterion or the distributor. So that's interesting. I guess they were still having to really drive home the fact that some of these actually had commentaries. Now it is a gatefold. The release is spread over 4 sides. A very nice gatefold too, with plenty of cast and crew imagery, and then a small quote from Cahiers du Cinema. I always mispronounce that. But it's a really nice, classy gatefold, I have to say. And here's the rear. Of course, I think the black and white imagery in the gatefold and the black color of the background go perfectly with the film being, of course, black and white. You get a really extensive essay here. You can usually tell if it's going to be a better essay if the text is a lot smaller to fit more on there. So as I mentioned before, it does have the audio essay. It's actually, I believe, originally in French, and it's read by Peter Bogdanovich. And then it has an excerpt from a later film where Renoir and others go back to some of the original shooting locations many years later. I think, yes, from 1967, so much later. And then, of course, you get the benefit of having the entire film in CAV. So really, you're just getting an audio commentary and that excerpt from a documentary. So not a stacked special edition or anything, but still a very, very welcome release. As far as I know, this was the first really decent version of the film available in this country on video. And of course, this carries the digital sound moniker, meaning you get the original French mono as PCM, which is always a bonus, because Criterion for a while seemed to go back and forth on including digital tracks, because Blow Up we just looked at does not have a digital track. This one does, and it's kind of awkward, but you have to actually make sure that it has a digital track by looking for that digital moniker hiding on the rear cover somewhere. But still, a really welcome release of one of the treasures of French cinema right here. And a lot harder to find than the CLV version for some reason. Now here's another important Criterion CAV release that's much less common than the CLV version. This is Spine 53, the Criterion release Forbidden Planet. This one is more of a special edition. It does still have some really awesome special features, some of which are still exclusive to this release. And I do like how here, for one of the first times, they get away from just having a blank background and they give this kind of washed out starry background instead of just having it as straight black. You can see they used an expanded image on the front, I guess also to keep the idea and the notion that this is a wide film in terms of the photography. The Criterion banner is placed in gold, and it uses the original Forbidden Planet typeface and title design from the original poster artwork. Although it's rendered in blue here, you usually see it in red or sometimes yellow, so it looks really striking. Even though it's not as good, of course, as the original poster artwork that's on the MGM releases, it's still a really nice, very striking and classy image from Criterion. The gatefold is exceptional and jam-packed with notes. These are primarily about the cast and crew and actually going into some of their back history from everybody, including the screenwriter to the costume designer, the director, the cinematographer, and then the lead actors. And of course, here's the original poster, but in more of a horizontal lobby format or British quad style. Here is a rendering of the monster itself, which is just beautifully done. And here is more of imagery from the film with more of these extensive notes. So a really jam-packed Criterion gatefold, which they didn't always do. Quite often you find it's just a bunch of images with a lot of dead space, but that was pretty common for most companies back then, because this is still an earlier release. Now you get a good essay here, and then you get your chapter breakdown. Because this is CAV encoded, it does help because the transfer out, because this is a very effects-laden widescreen film. The special features on here are extremely important. They include publicity stills, film stills, and then actual footage of deleted materials that are really unavailable in any other release. So it makes this Criterion release still very important. There's a wealth of information in a text essay included in the supplemental section, and it also is jam-packed with extra images and stills. So it is one of the really well-stuffed supplemental text sections at the end of any Criterion title. So it's really recommended for the extras alone. The transfer is interesting because there are some differences when comparing this to the later MGM versions. MGM did it twice before putting out a DVD. And it's since been remastered in HD with a brand new transfer and audio mix by Warner Brothers. I mentioned this a bit when I talked about the standalone MGM release that replaced this in the early 90s, but there are some color differences. This print, it seems like it's the same source print that MGM used, but this Criterion disc is a bit softer, as most Criterion discs are when they're compared to the later MGM ones, and the color seems a little bit lighter, I would say. So it's still a really good presentation, and it is CAV, which is better than the CLV encoding on the MGM disc, but that one's just a bit sharper. It's also a bit noisier on that one, so this one is better in that regard as well. And of course, being CAV, it's a lot smoother. But the audio is really interesting because you can decode it out in Dolby Pro Logic, and it seems to have some dialogue panning and some music and sound effects panning, which would be accurate because Forbidden Planet, for all my research notes have led me to believe, was released in both a 4-track magnetic for its original release prints, which would have been left, center, right, and a mono surround, and also had engagements in Perspecta, which was the poor man's surround system that used a bunch of control tones to kind of steer a mono signal around a theater. And that was really kind of used in the 50s to give some type of enhancement to a theater that either didn't want to or couldn't afford having magnetic stereo capability, or was in a smaller town or something like that. So it is a different audio mix, and so that makes it also doubly important. So the picture quality is great, the audio is great, it is digitally encoded, so you get that in PCM. And this is just a really well-stuffed, great Criterion release of an important science fiction landmark. And the differences are so important that I also would recommend having this alongside the MGM disc. And the sound mixes are very different to the Warner Brothers modern one, because they only found segments of the original masters and had to make up a new surround track, and it has no sound or dialogue panning in the front channels. So absolutely recommended. If you've never seen this film, you should. It's the granddaddy of big science fiction films, and this is an exceptional, well-stacked Criterion release with a really, really important transfer and fantastic extras that should still be around. So this is one of those Criterions that you should pick up simply for the extras section if you like the film, and if you're transfer geek like me, you'll want it for the different audio track and color timing. Here we go with spine number 54. This is the Criterion release of Zulu, and I haven't got the chance to spin this up yet, this particular edition. Of course, the film is an important classic. It's really the film that broke Michael Caine to most audiences, or at least British audiences. Of course, this coming out in 1964 and then would have come out in about 65 over here, was just before the Ipcris file, and then of course is 2 years before Alfie, which is what really broke him internationally. Now it's a very simple, straightforward Criterion jacket, but again, you see they're going with a widescreen image to really give you the scale and scope of the film, which is really, really well done. Does have a gatefold, which is jam-packed with a huge essay that's absolutely wonderful. And it's actually very readable, even though the text is kind of small, because it's on this kind of navy blue background, which I guess they kind of chose the navy blue to give a sort of more military theme. I mean, it does work, so. And again, this is really one of the, I think, again, this is probably the first decent release the film had in this country in terms of actually being widescreen and having the film's original mix not messed with. I haven't got to spin this disc up yet, but it does have the film soundtrack as a digital PCM, hence the digital sound logo here. I don't know if it's in mono or stereo. I think the film has had engagements in both, but I think it's primarily a mono movie. The essay is also really good here on the back, so it is separate from the massive gatefold text. Now outside of that, there are no special features on this, and it is a CLV disc. It's relatively easier to find. I also think there's another catalog number version of this for some reason, so that's why you can probably find it pretty easily. And of course, this has been surpassed by the DVD, and then there have been several Blu-ray versions, but a lot of those are really problematic, and it's very hard to find one that has good image quality and has the original audio mix. I believe a lot of fans have had to resort to kind of mixing different versions together, taking the audio track from one and mixing it to the video source of another. So this Criterion Laserdisc is still a very viable way of watching the film if you have a really good player, you know, and you enjoy your setup and you enjoy Laserdisc. It's I checked out the transfer for about a second, and it does look very good. I just haven't had the time to watch the whole transfer all the way through. So again, a straightforward, no frills, but well, I won't exactly say no frills because the text information is really, really good and extremely detailed. So a bit fancier than a standard Criterion release, and because the film's so long, it made it onto 2 discs, but still a nice way to watch the film if you come across it. All right, now here's a really big one. I've talked about this a whole lot over the years, and a lot of people, at least on online forums, know about this these days, but I don't know if they may know the extreme amount of detail I'm about to go into. So this is spine number 60, and this is of course the CAV box set of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now this is an important Criterion release for many reasons. It's also very important in 2001 releases. This disc release is the only version of the film that was ever signed off on and approved by Stanley Kubrick himself. They sent dailies and tests over that were then sampled by Kubrick and his editor while they were working on Full Metal Jacket. So I think, if I remember correctly, the people at Criterion said they had to redo it like at least 10 or 15 times before it was approved by Kubrick himself. So, you know, it was done with a lot of care and attention to detail, even though this is, you know, a 1989 disc, so it's technically not going to be as good as a later disc that could have had the advancements that came with time. So that being said, the color timing and the sound are intact, and on video for a 1989 Laserdisc release, this is absolutely as close as you could get to a original print being run in a proper theater. Of course, finding a proper theater back then, or even now, especially now, is much easier said than done. So, and still to this day, this Laserdisc will give you a fantastic presentation. Now, it is a bit warmer in color timing than a lot of the later releases, and the sound design is directly struck from the original 6-track mix from the 70mm prints and simply run through a Dolby Pro Logic encoder. So when you play it back in your system, you just need to engage whatever matrixing processing you have, whether it's Pro Logic 2, Neo 6, and you'll be able to hear that design matrix backed out, and it sounds wonderful even though it's not discrete. And you also get the original bits of design that have been lost in the remix on all the later Warner Brothers versions. There's some panning of dialogue and music, primarily in all of the major dialogue scenes. Of course, there are not a lot of them, but there are some, and that should have never been taken out in the first place. But anyway, that's the main difference in terms of the mix versus the remix. Now, you do get a nice essay here. It's a standard box, so you have the disc just tucked inside with a John Mulvaney letter. And it mentions it's an exclusive new film-to-tape transfer. What that means is, of course, they did it themselves, and you can definitely tell because a lot of time and effort went into this. This is loaded with supplements. There's bits with Arthur C. Clarke, and tons of text slides and tons of more text slides with just dozens and dozens and dozens of stills, photographs, drawings, concepts, blueprints, you name it. So it really is a stacked, interesting, and very informative supplemental section. And it's also really neat to see how people looked at doing the special features for this film back in 1989 versus all the stuff that's been done since then. Of course, it is CAV encoded, so it's spread across a good number of sides. It pretty much goes all the way to side 6, where then the supplementals take over. And here you have the extensive video production credits for the disc itself. Now, the other thing I should mention is that here's the letter itself. The transfer was struck from a 35mm inner positive instead of the 65mm negative, because at the time there was no real way, at least for most places, to be able to actually scan from a 65mm source. So they used a 35mm source and just kind of mastered from that. And it's unknown if that caused any differences, but it doesn't seem as much because all of the successive MGM versions were struck from 65mm sources. And the first MGM CLV disc had some issues that made it not as good as this Criterion release, so they had to go back and fix it for the CAV box. And that was the first release to finally actually look and sound better than this. Again, the other thing I should point out as well is that the audio track on here, though excellent, if you have a really good sound system and you also have the MGM release, you'll notice that this Criterion release has a little noise every once in a while that it doesn't really intrude, but the MGM version does not have that, so the audio track is a little bit cleaner, but this is just being really nitpicky. And speaking of being nitpicky, why have one 2001 box set when you can have 2 copies? Now, you may ask why I have 2 copies and why I keep one that's a little beat up. Well, for some reason, all copies of this box set that usually come up are always beat up. I think they were well played, well loved, and carted around a lot. So you're almost always going to find it with some damage. The reason why I have 2 copies is there were 2 different print runs of this box set. The original copies were all printed by 3M, and they're relatively rot prone. In fact, that first copy is a 3M copy, and it does have some speckling. That was the I just picked that up on a lark because it came in a lot, and I was happy to see it was the alternate version. Now, this version is the rarer one. This was a repressing by Pioneer, and they actually pressed the CLV version that you can find without all the extras. And it's cleaner. It has no rot issues. So this will be the one you want to look for if you want to get this box set. And of course, the only way you're going to be able to know is if you just look at the actual disc ring codes themselves. If you look up the film's, if you look up this release's LDDB page, it has the mint markings for the different pressing plants. And if you want to actually compare and contrast, you can actually then identify a box set that is a Pioneer pressing. And again, the 3M copies, you know, some people have had them heavily rotted. Mine just has a little bit of speckling here and there. It's not bad at all. But since the Pioneer copies are out there, you might as well look for one. The only other thing I should mention is the Pioneer copy has a slightly different framing. The framing is shifted over to the side just a hair. So that's another reason, if you're a diehard Kubrick nerd like myself and have already put way too much time into researching all about 2001 and have been badgering Warner Brothers to bring back the original sound mix for like 16 years, and they're finally going to do it on the 4K release, thank goodness, then you might want to have both copies, because one version has a tiny bit more on the left and one version has a tiny bit more on the right. But again, this was only discovered after I went back and forth a lot, and after some other folks online took some screen captures of the different ones, and we noticed that the Pioneer versions, both CAV and CLV, were shifted over to the side just a hair. So that's yet another weird, odd little difference for 2001. But anyway, a really important Criterion box, one everybody should own. Although if you want the best technical presentation, I'd argue for the MGM CAV box. It's a bit cleaner. It's from a 65mm source, and the audio is a bit cleaner as well. And then, of course, they added the 5.1 reissue version. If you want the 5.1 track, you can grab that, or the first DVD. But still, a really important release. Still has some exclusive extras mixed in here. Some have been replicated on later releases, but you're really getting this for the historical importance, Kubrick's approval on the transfer, and that it's one of the really big, important Criterion boxes. And of course, I can never stop talking about Stanley Kubrick, so here is Spine 64, the Criterion release of The Killing. This is no special edition. It's a standard, simple Criterion release, and even though it looks very spare, I think the blankness of the cover, I think it does look very classy, and it really highlights the image from the planning scene. So again, no frills. At least you get a nice little essay, but again, like a lot of other discs, this has gone back to being just a analog only disc. And of course, at this point in time, you know, going by spine numbers, it didn't exactly mean that, you know, certain spine numbers came in succession. So we're kind of jumping back and forth in terms of what year they came out. I think almost all Criterion discs by 1989, 1990 had added digital sound, but still, I wish they had just gotten to a point where all of them had it. But still, I've compared this to the MGM version, and that one does have a digital track, but they're very comparable, and I think the transfers may be, I don't know if they're exactly the same, but they seem pretty close. So this is really one more for Kubrick nerds like myself, or Criterion completists, or you know, if you just come across it for cheap, you know, you can't say no to a cheap Criterion. I know I certainly can't. It's still just a nice, simple release, and at least it was getting the film out there in a good transfer. Now here comes a really good one. This is Spine 66. This is the 50th anniversary special edition of Adventures of Robin Hood. Now, of course, this is also issued with a different cover, the one they used for the CLV, that takes a section of an original poster. So the discs are the same, but you just have to know that there are the two cover variations. This one came first, if I'm not mistaken. But this is a really, really nice release. It has a bevy of special features, and I do like the look of this. At first I thought it was kind of strange, but it's like Robin himself has torn through the jacket cover and is ready to strike against injustices, as always. There's a really nice gatefold that goes into the Academy Award nominations, and then a bit about the principal cast and crew. And I again, the dark green, at first it doesn't look like it would work, but it really does, especially when you have it in your hands, as opposed to just looking at photos online. And then for the rest, they've reproduced, I believe this is an original lobby card, and it's really nice because you can see the sort of hand-tinted effect that was on most lobby cards. Of course, the Technicolor photography in this film looks nothing like this, so that also kind of makes it slightly amusing to me. And here you have an original. That's an interesting picture. I haven't seen this particular one before, but it's really nice when they just tuck those in there. Now the rear, you get the standard Criterion slate. You get the digital sound moniker. It has the film's original monos, PCM. You had a nice Rudy Belmer essay, who also gives a wonderful audio commentary, and it's a different commentary track from the one he did on the Warner Brothers DVD release that's been ported to the Blu-ray. So it is nice to have a completely separate commentary for the film. It includes an excerpt from the original 1922 Doug Fairbanks Robin Hood epic, but it does have Rudy Belmer's comments over it, so it's not like you're just getting an excerpt of it. You're getting an excerpt with some critical background. And if you're a fan of this film, you absolutely should see the Fairbanks original. It includes a lot more of the tale, and it was an absolute epic for its time. Now, it's just great. It really is. But of course, silent films are a hard sell for most people. It does include some behind-the-scenes home movies that were actually shot on the production. I think most of this was included in the documentary footage that's on the Warner Brothers DVD, but still, it was nice to have it included here. It also has a clip from the MGM version of Ivanhoe from 1952, which was I think it was a bigger success over in England than here, but it was still really well known as being one of the, really good, swashbuckler adventure films from that era, and that was really kind of when they were starting to taper off. And it's still a really good film. And if you've seen my other videos, you know I raved about how good the Technicolor photography is on that Laserdisc, and I still swear by that. And then you get some text and stills and a few clips of other Robin Hood adaptations, primarily some music clips and bits of various TV versions. And then, of course, the film presented in CAV, which is a big help. Now, if you look at the transfer, it is noticeably different from the remastered HD Warner Brothers version. Some purists have said that the Warner Brothers color timing is a little off, and I of course I've never seen an original print. I would absolutely love to, but Warner Brothers went in and did the recombining of the 3-strip Technicolor elements digitally with their ultra resolution process, so it looks stunning. But you do get a slightly more vintage look when you go back to this Criterion version. And I will say that when you compare this version to the MGM single disc release, that one kind of looks a bit more garish. It's very hard to do these very vivid 3-strip Technicolor films, particularly in the analog video domain. I've found that every time I go and watch any Technicolor film from the 30s, 40s, really even into the 50s, it's just very difficult to time it right. Things either look pasty or overbearing. I remember when I first put on that MGM version of MGM disc of Robin Hood, it just looked pretty garish. So I think this one technically is a better transfer, but I think it's pretty much the same element. And of course, this is CAV versus that being CLV. So a really nice release, and unfortunately the Warner Brothers Blu-ray has the mono as a glossy Dolby track. I think it's like it's better than the DVD, but it's only like a 640 kilobits per second track. It was a very early Blu-ray release. It pretty much ported over the DVD and just bumped up the transfer to HD. And it was so early, it was literally the first Blu-ray I ever bought. As soon as I heard it was out, I didn't even have a player. It just immediately found its way into my hands, and my wallet was emptier. But anyway, if you've never seen the film, you absolutely have to. While I'm a huge Errol Flynn fan, and I absolutely adore this film, as everyone should, and it is the definitive Robin Hood for good reason, and it will, I would normally say most likely never be duplicated, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it will never be duplicated. They can't even do Robin Hood correctly these days for the most part. So you absolutely have to. And then hopefully you decide to take the plunge and try the other great Errol Flynn swashbucklers, you know, everything from Captain Blood to Seahawk to, you know, they're all great, particularly Captain Blood. But anyway, this is a really nice Criterion release. I absolutely recommend it. If you manage to find it, you're usually going to find the CLV version instead of this deluxe CAV package. And again, it seems this green cover is kind of getting a little rarer these days. I usually just find the CLV with the other cover, or occasionally I find the CAV with the other cover as well. But just a really, really well done release. That's got some exclusive extras. The transfer is interesting, and it has the original mono mix. So absolutely fantastic. So here we go with Spine 67A. This is the CLV reissue of Seven Samurai. Beautiful cover image. I still think this is probably the best cover of any of the film's video releases. Criterion reused this for the first DVD, and I just think it looks wonderful. Of course, this replaces the older CAV box, but again, the benefit of having this is this adds the film's mono as in PCM. The older box set was an analog-only disc, unfortunately. So you lose the special features that were in that set, but nicely enough, they left the audio commentary on. So you can pick this up and not have to switch sides so often. You get the soundtrack, and you get the digital track, and you get the audio commentary if you're so inclined. You get a nice essay, and then just the usual Criterion banner. There's a little bit of like a weathering design. I don't know if this is going to come across here in the background. So it's not just the standard slate It's not a standard slate background. It's got some texturing detail in it, and it's a glossy jacket. So that indicates this is a slightly later printing. This is from about 90 or 91 or so, whereas the old box was like from 88 or 89. So a nicer release to have. And what's also nice is that I wanted to pick this up since even though the really fancy, gorgeous looking Criterion Blu-ray box set is out there and available, and you should own it, the film's monotrack on there has been a bit over scrubbed, which is a problem that happens more and more often these days. Even with classic releases, they go in, and when they're doing the digital cleanup, removing pops, ticks, thumps, and crackle, they get a bit overzealous, or the programs are left at an automated state. And it's kind of getting to the point where it's like the old days of early CD adoption, where they would use too much heavy no noise reduction, and they'd remove things in addition to just removing the tape hiss, which is naturally supposed to be there. So the fact that this is happening more and more often in the film world now, where even old Laserdisc tracks or even lossy DVD tracks have more audio detail in them than the HD codecs on the fully restored Blu-ray versions, is really a bit disconcerting. So, and this is out there. You can look it up online. I think there's a whole essay about Seven Samurai, and then I think Rashomon is also similarly affected, and people have made comparisons to foreign non-Criterion Blu-ray releases, and so it doesn't matter. It can happen to anybody these days. So that's another reason why it's useful sometimes to just track down the old Laserdisc with the digital track. And this particular disc is not super common either, so I was just very happy to actually find it. The box set's expensive, and this is a bit expensive. I don't think they made too many of them, but it's definitely cheaper than the box, and I recommend it for the digital track, and you get the commentary included, and again, you have to flip less sides. So you can't have too many copies of Seven Samurai, just like you can't have too many copies of Spine 69, the Criterion release of Blade Runner. Now this is, I should say 69A, this is the single disc CLV version, without the supplemental section on the CAV version. Now, of course, it does a re-rendering, a new painting of the film's iconic artwork, and although it takes a little while to get used to, kind of has an airbrush look, it is very nice, and you kind of get used to it, even though at first the green title and all of this just kind of, it looks a bit cheapish. But once you get used to it, it's kind of become iconic. And as you can see, this was a very well-loved copy. Everybody carted this around. I get the feeling this was used to convince many people that Blade Runner was actually great and they should see it about 5,000 times. Now you get a nice essay on the back. This is the CLV version, so it's just split onto two sides. It does have a digital Dolby Surround encoded track, and this is the original 1982 mix, which is a bit differently done than all of the presentations you're going to hear on the archival discs. They use like a 5.1 track that was conformed from all three versions. So if you play this back to back with like the director's cut version, you're going to notice there's some mixing differences. This one, and of course this is really just for Super Blade Runner nerds or sound nerds, so you can hear the difference between a mix done in 1982 versus a mix done in 92, where they just had better processing and decoders and stuff, because they really didn't remix anything for the director's cut. They just removed the voiceover, so I assume they went back to the dialogue, music, and effects stems, and the EQ is a bit different. So that's one of the good reasons to actually have the old Criterion version. Of course, this is of the international cut version, which is the slightly extended 1982 release version. So instead of just having the American version with the narration and the happy ending, it has in the about, I'd say combined, it's maybe a total of 2 minutes. I think it's actually much less than that, but I'll just say roughly about 2 minutes of violent shots that were removed from the US theatrical version. And the director's cut doesn't have them either, because they didn't have enough time to get the pieces of the international cut from overseas to incorporate it back in. They're supposed to be there, but that's why they're not there. So, and of course, these were all reincorporated into the final cut. They were always intended to be there. They were just trimmed out by the MPAA to get a decent rating. So anyway, those are the two real reasons why you should have this. I'll also say that the transfer is really nice, even though it is older, so it is a bit noisy, but it has a more vivid color timing, kind of more akin to the very early pan and scan embassy home releases that a lot of fans kind of like because they have a very vintage look to them. And there's been some discussion online about how what different release prints according to the time period may have looked like. A lot of people still wonder what a 1982 release print would look like, if they could find a unfaded one, if it would look very different from the director's cut or the eventual final cut. So if you're a big Blade Runner fan, you probably already have this disc or know of it. In this day and age, it's really going to be picked up for, if you're going for Criterion completion, or if you're going to set out to try and pick up all the different versions of Blade Runner on home video, or you just want it because it's an iconic Criterion title. But the real reason you should pick it up is to get the slightly different looking transfer with the different color timing, and the fact that it is the international cut with the original violent bits that were cut out of the US theatrical version, and that it has the film's original Dolby Stereo soundtrack, which, as far as I know, is not on any release past this era. Because starting with the director's cut, that's mix done from the original elements, and then the newer archival branch discs with the three main different versions that aren't the final cut or the work print, those are all based off of a brand new track. So it doesn't have all of the exact nuances that this audio mix does. So this will get you the original 1982 mix, and it is surround encoded, and it sounds incredible because for a film with this vintage, it has a really, really well done matrix surround track. Even though it was primarily intended to be heard in the 70mm release, the Dolby Stereo is no slouch, and if you want to hear the film the way you would have heard it in a standard theater back in '82, you can pick this up, and of course you get the bonus of having the international version with the scenes put back in. Now here's another one that I was very, very pleasantly surprised with. This is another one of my all-time favorite Criterion titles, and it's a release that not many talk about, but it has some exclusive features, and the transfer itself is amazing. So this is another one of my top recommendations. This is spine number 73, the Criterion release of Casablanca in its CAV version. It later came out in a CLV version without all of these special features, and that cover just has Rick in front of the major doorway of Rick's Cafe, which itself is a great cover. And like a lot of other CLV reissue discs, it uses the whole cover image. Here they've gone with a design that instead of just having the standard background, they've given the shading shadow of what looks like a palm tree, which is a nice touch. And then they use the original typeface and font and color from the original one sheet. That's of course immediately synonymous with the film. And then you have the normal Criterion logo and banner. So it's a pretty nice jacket and looks much better and more impressive than their standard, one color background only jacket. So you open up the gatefold, and it's a pretty nice gatefold, even though it does look pretty simple at first due to just the standard background color. You get a wonderful essay piece from Ronald Haver, who also of course does the commentary, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. You get the complete cast list, so instead of just giving you the top leads and a few of the character actors, this literally gives you the entire official cast list. And then here it gives you a list of all of the songs in the film, of course not only the famous songs, but all of the other incidental pieces that are played in the cafe and other areas. And then here you have a copy of the film's horizontal poster, and then of course the famous one sheet over here in its door version. And then of course a beautifully reproduced publicity still of Ingrid, and you can't have too many of this. And here is the back. This continues Haver's essay that starts in the beginning of the gatefold, and it's actually a really nice piece. Of course, as I mentioned before, he also does the commentary, which I kind of wish I had heard before I became a gigantic Casablanca nerd, because listening to Haver's commentary on here is essentially like listening to all the other commentaries and reading all the Casablanca books and the books about the making of the film, because there's a good number of them now and I've read all about all of them. And I wish I'd heard this commentary first, because this commentary covers much of the same ground. So if you listen to this commentary, you can basically become a Casablanca expert in less than 2 hours. It is one of the best, most informative, and warm commentaries I've yet come across. It's one of my all-time favorites, and if you've listened to a lot of commentaries, if they're informative, they can usually be on the dry side, and this is not. It's a fascinating listen, and well recommended. And the other commentaries are great too, but this one is one of the great, classic Criterion commentaries. In addition to that, you get newsreel footage of the city of Casablanca, which of course was captured just before the film's premiere, so that was like free publicity for the film when it came out in December 42, January 43. And then you get excerpts from the Lux Radio Theater broadcast version, which I think, had Hedy Lamarr. And then, which is a nice listen if you've ever listened to any of the Lux Radio Theater or other radio adaptations of classic films. It's interesting to see how it plays on radio, and also hear other actors do like really iconic roles. And sometimes they'd be reprised by the original actors if available. But anyway, so that's nice that they gave you excerpts of that. You get tons of production material, publicity material, various stills, studio documents in the pretty, as of this point in time, it's a pretty straightforward Criterion supplemental text section. But instead of just having, screen after screen after screen of about 15 or 20 text slides, it's jam-packed with all kinds of information. And what's really interesting is it has a full breakdown of the studio proposed sequel, which was going to be called Brazzaville, which alludes to where both Rick and Renault would find themselves after the conclusion of the film. And it really goes into a complete breakdown of the first, second, third act and conclusion of what would have happened in the Casablanca sequel had it been made by Warner Brothers in 1943, 1944, after the runaway success of this film. And there's some really fantastic material in there, and just like the commentary, it's extremely informative. And the only other way you'd find out a lot of this stuff is if you read all the various different books and listened to the other commentaries and read a ton of articles. So it's a really jam-packed supplemental section full of materials. Now, that's where most people would stop, but I'm going to continue on because I've also been a long-time admirer of the photography of the film. The film was shot by Arthur Edison, who was one of the great cinematographers who photographed everything from Casablanca to working with James Whale on his classic horror films. So Casablanca has a very, very, very intricate lighting style. It's full of deep blacks and really luscious silvers, and it has this gray tone to the black and white that until the brand new 4K restoration, which is available on the newest Blu-ray and hopefully a UHD release sometime soon, this is the first time I've seen it on video outside of the 4K restoration and the 35mm prints, if you're lucky enough to still see one. This is the only other video edition I've seen that has the proper grayscale. It looks amazing. It is one of the best black and white transfers to a Laserdisc I've seen. It looks better than most black and white DVDs, and especially when you're viewing on a really good 4:3 CRT, you'd swear you were watching something better. And it has a vintage quality to it, but it never is too soft. Like I said, it's really in the grayscale, the details of the silver and the details in the contrast between black and white. It looks absolutely stunning. It looks practically identical to the last time I saw a print of the film, and it is the only video release that comes close to the new 4K mastered version. And if you have any of the other versions in between, they look great. They are what they are, but they've been cleaned up. They're from dupe copies, And you know, they're kind of, if you compare the two, like if you compare this to the later MGM Laserdiscs, even the CAV box set, the MGM versions, you know, are a bit brighter. They don't have the same level of detail in the grayscale, and the contrast is kind of jacked up a bit on the MGM release, which is totally fine. You know, that is, you know, a way of presenting films, but it certainly doesn't have the vintage look of a 1942 film exactly. And especially when you put these side by side, the difference, it will jump right out at you. And it also has the film's mono as digitally encoded PCM, which sounds incredible. And I actually think this track sounds better than the versions that are found on the DVDs and Blu-rays, because even though the newly 4K source Blu-ray has the original track, it is kind of compressed slightly, and I actually think this digital track on the Criterion release sounds better than any of the Blu-rays, the new restoration, the DVDs, or even the MGM versions. But again, that may be just me. I haven't had time to, you know, go in and do a you know, full-on digital analysis. The only way to really do that is to do a capture of all the different sources and get them into a music program where you can look at the waveforms and really do a detailed comparison. But I'd like to do that one day. But that's just something I thought I'd mention. So this disc is really important for the special features, the commentary, but the transfer is by far and large the best part. The transfer is outstanding. And like I said, outside of the 4K mastered new Blu-ray, which you should already own, it's dirt cheap and absolutely essential, this is the best video edition of the film. It's the best Laserdisc by far, and it's better than the DVDs, even though it is still a Laserdisc. It's just a beautiful rendition of one of the greatest films ever made. The black and white, the way the black and white comes across, even on this old analog transfer, is just something else. It's absolutely beautiful, and I was really, really happy that I finally tracked this down. Even if you just come across the CLV, I'd recommend checking that out. If you have any other copy of the film in between this and the 4K sourced remaster, just give it a comparison, you know, see what you think. But it's really, really gorgeous, and this will really give you the impression of what watching a print of the film looks like, because they're still occasionally print showings, and they're absolutely fantastic. So the only ways to ever really watch this film are the new 4K restoration, a print of the film, or this Criterion release, hands down. Here we go with spine number 79. This title was just released as a Criterion Blu-ray. Of course, talking about Shampoo, the Hal Ashby film with Warren Beatty. That's, you know, it of course really is a product of its time, product of the 70s, but it's essentially, you know, the day in the life of a hairdresser and Los Angeles Lothario of sorts, amidst the 1968 presidential election. So it's really more of a it's kind of a hard film to describe. It's sort of like a cross between an art film, a day in the life, a comedy, a sex comedy. You really should just see it. If you've ever seen any of Hal Ashby's other films, you'll kind of know what you're in for. But you know, it's definitely, again, a product of its times, historically significant, and you know, you get to see a lot of kind of famous names of the era kind of loosen up a bit in terms of you know, kind of breaking down some barriers and doing some different stuff. It's a simple, straightforward Criterion disc, no special features, no supplemental section. It's just a single CLV disc, but it is letterboxed, which I think was a first for the film. I think all the other ones are just opened up or pen and scanned, and it has the original mono in PCM. So, and you do get at least a pretty nice little essay about the film and Ashby and Warren Beatty and the time period of both when the film was made and when it was set in '68. So if you come across this, it's a pretty nice transfer. The film has some really, you know, interesting uses of color. Pretty much any 70s film from this era will have its own distinctive photographic style and look. So it's recommended. It may not be for everyone. There was a DVD, but that was kind of out of print for a while. So now you can just grab the Criterion Blu-ray, which has I think a couple new extras. Or if you find this one, you can pick it up for pretty cheap because it's not a special edition or anything. Here's another one of the, you know, new Hollywood 60s and 70s films. This is spine number 81, the Criterion release of 5 easy pieces. And just like Shampoo, it's just a movie-only single CLV disc with no special features. But instead of having more of a different design, this goes back to the standard single image, but they've spread across the entire jacket. And it's a really nice jacket for Criterion, I think. It really gives you the tone of the film, you know, sort of the inherent downbeat quality of it. You get the original typeface, which I always like how they did that. And it just looks classy always, I think, with the black Criterion bar printed across the top. And on the rear, we continue with that design. You get another nice Criterion essay here, and then the chapter breakdowns. Again, I think this was a first for the film being in widescreen. There was also a Columbia release, which is a standalone. I think that one may have been 133. I don't think it was widescreen. And then, of course, being a Columbia title, you might run into rot issues if it came from the DADC plant. But Criterion did a number of these films that then were either later reissued by their respective studios or put out at the same time, which I don't know exactly why they do that, but that still happens even today when Criterion puts out a Blu-ray. Either it's already come out from the regular studio or the studio puts out like a bare bones version at the same time as the Criterion, so that practice still goes on. It does have a digital soundtrack with the film's original mono, so it's just another nice, no frills, but well put together Criterion release of an important, you know, new Hollywood Renaissance film. Now here we go with one of the really, really nice big Criterion special editions. This is spine number 95, the special edition of The Great Escape. It's just a beautiful jacket that takes and adapts the normal Criterion style into just a really vivid but understated and very classy rendition of barbed wire that would be surrounding the prisoner of war camp. And they've gone with the full banner across, full Criterion logo across the top in this nice kind of off green. But it's just a really, really nice jacket, which has a fantastic gatefold. Here you get a little bit of information about the film and the production in just these general paragraphs, because the entirety of the gatefold is given over to the original pre-production drawing and layout of the entire camp itself, with all of the barracks numbered and then all of the individual locations labeled. And then here, if you look very closely, you actually have the 2 escape tunnels, the dummy tunnel and then the second full tunnel leading all the way out, and it's diagrammed all the way to show you where it starts and then where it's supposed to end, and then everything is laid out here to just show you how into how much detail the production was going into to make this not only accurate, but, you know, to plan out every single last detail, almost as if they were trying to plan an escape themselves. So that's just a really, really nice touch that the entire production sketch was reproduced here in the gatefold. Now, the rear looks pretty simple, but it actually belies that this is a full-on Criterion special edition. Instead of just having an essay, this entire written piece is from the film's director, John Sturges, and he also recorded an audio commentary, which is on the analog track, and it also has some snippets from the film's composer, Elmer Bernstein, and a few others of the production crew. And it's a wonderful, it's not quite a roundtable discussion because more people talk than others, and they were, of course, recorded separately, but it is one of the great, super informative Criterion tracks. Even if you don't have this and you like the film, you've got to listen to the commentary. Sturges is not one to mince words. It is a fantastic listen, even though the film is, of course, a longer one. The supplemental section is loaded with publicity stills, more production blueprints and planning and drawings and conceptual artwork and sketches, notes about the cast and crew, original trailer material, continuity material. It's just a loaded Criterion special edition, even though it's not a trifold or a box set or anything. It's just a 2-disc release. Unfortunately, it's not a full CAV version. With that being said, even though it's an older disc and the transfer, of course, is going to be a little bit soft compared to later releases, it's actually a really nice transfer. It's got nice color. It's widescreen, which was really a first for the film. Most earlier releases were pan and scan, and that's really terrible to do to a big epic film like this. And it does have the film's original mono mix, digitally encoded as PCM. Which is also great because the film's been subjected to 5.1 remix, which isn't that good, and the mono is far better. And also the film's had an interesting transfer history. The latest restored version you can get on Blu-ray has been subject to some really questionable color timing, which is not really accurate looking. Some people say it's too teal or too blue, and I think I really agree with that, but you just have to look at it for yourself. You can look up comparison photos online. Now, if you compare this to the MGM letterbox release that came out after this disc, it is a little bit sharper of a transfer, like a lot of MGM later releases after a Criterion version, even if it's the same element. But for some reason, when MGM transferred that, they transferred the entirety of the original camera negative image. So it's a much wider image. It's actually framed quite too wide. And when they made their first DVD, they just used the same transfer. So if you pick up the MGM Laserdisc or the first letterbox DVD, where the whole movie's just crammed down onto one disc, it's framed like at a super wide, like I think 2.5 or 2.6 to 1. Which, if I'm recalling correctly, they shot it wide, and then they decided that it was just a little too wide, so then they just decided to release the film in a narrower ratio, which this disc and the successive DVDs and Blu-rays are at. So you'll just want to pick up the MGM Laser or that first DVD for the alternate, slightly wider framing. If you look up the film's DVD Beaver image comparison page, you can actually see that DVD included, and you'll see that it is a much wider framing. So if you're curious to see how different that might look, you can look that up there. But this is the most stacked release the film has gotten to date. It's one of the great Criterion special editions where they really went the extra mile to present it correctly. I also think there was either a pressing or manufacturing issue with the original runs where some things in the supplemental section were not encoded correctly. If you look up the film's LDDB listing, there's more details about that. I think that's why this sticker down here is about that the discs are made in Japan and the jacket is printed in the US. I think the corrected copies all carry that little sticker on there. I don't think it's anything major, but I do remember there being something about that, so I figured I'd mention that. But still, essential, great Criterion Special Edition with some essential special features and one of the great Criterion commentaries. So absolutely pick it up if you find it. Here we go with Criterion 100, and this is a title I've wanted to pick up for a very long time. This is, of course, Hitchcock's Notorious, the CAV version, and the DVD Criterion put out of Notorious was actually the first Criterion DVD I was ever able to buy with my own pocket money. I remember seeing it was announced that it came out, and I was so excited, and I saved up my allowance for ever and ever and ever, and just saved up every penny I could find, and went out and plunked down $50 for the DVD version, which pretty much seems to use the same transfer as this, and that's long been one of my favorite black and white film presentations on DVD. And I've always felt that transfer is better than the cleaned up version MGM did and put out on DVD and then later Blu-ray. Criterion has now announced they're going to reissue the film on Blu-ray with a new restored master, so that should be truly great. It's been a long time coming, seeing the Criterion Hitchcock titles come back to being in the collection again. But this is just an elegant Laserdisc, and it is another extraordinary black and white presentation on disc. It's sourced from the best archival elements they had at the time, and if you've seen the DVD Criterion put out, it's the same transfer shown here, and it's a beautiful one. I like how they've done the jacket. It's glossily printed, so the deep blacks of the photograph come out very, very well, and they choose an appropriate image, I think. And then the background color is this nice off silver, so it kind of gives this element of classiness to it. And again, the beautiful Criterion box in black. You open up the gatefold, It's just a standard succession of pictures on a background. Makes me think of a typical Paramount gatefold, actually, but I like how they've chosen to stay with black. Here you have one of the film's original horizontal posters, or that's probably just a lobby card. And then here you have 2 promo stills from the film. And the rear has the typical Criterion design. Now, this being the CAV version, you get a Rudy Belmer audio commentary, which is a great listen. All of these supplemental features were carried over to the DVD, so the Laserdisc doesn't have anything exclusive. The one difference, of course, being the packaging's different on the DVD, and the DVD has a lossy Dolby Digital mono versus the Laserdisc having the PCM mono. You get a essay from Rudy Belmer as well, and if you've ever read any of his work, in addition to his fantastic work in commentaries and documentaries and such, he's long been one of the great film historians. So it's a lovely essay piece. And then in addition to the commentary, you get the Lux Radio Theater adaptation, the theatrical and secondary trailers, and then production photos, and then the usual text commentary at the end with the text stills talking about the film, the production, its development from the short story, which I think was in the Saturday Evening Post, the various iterations it went through before it finally got produced, and then the troubles they had with the MacGuffin plot device of the film being essentially uranium for a potential foreign-made atomic weapon, which is a really interesting bit of film history if you've never heard that story. So I definitely suggest you at least read up on the production of this film. The side bricks are well chosen. Like I said, it's full CAV. If you pick up the CLV version, you're going to lose the special features, but the transfer itself is so wonderful, and you get the benefit of having the film's sound in digital lossless PCM. So I'd even recommend that. You cannot have too many copies of this film. I do think it has now become kind of lesser regarded in the Hitchcock canon, which is really a shame, because not only do I think it's one of his best, I also think it's one of the greatest films ever made, and really the prototype for virtually every spy film that's ever been made since 1946. And it's really an incredible piece of work, and is absolutely the film you can point to in the argument that people always seem to have where they talk about classic stars not being really good actors. And you need no further evidence of Cary Grant's immense acting talents than Notorious, which is just an incredible piece of work if you're just looking at the main 3 performances alone. But anyway, I could talk about Notorious for hours, but it's just a lovely, extremely classy, beautiful Criterion disc. Again, I love the packaging. The transfer is first rate, great black and white on Laserdisc, and it was so good they pretty much just reused it for the DVD. So hopefully the Blu-ray is equally impressive when that comes out. I'm sure it will be. But again, just beautiful, beautiful release for Spine 100. Now here we have an interesting CLV version of a big Criterion box. This is Spine 125A, the CLV release of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Of course, it uses the original key art and text of the film's original poster and promotional materials. So it's the same cover as the box set. Now, the box set was the first time the film's theatrical cut from 1977 had been presented on home video. Pretty much all the previous versions would have the special edition version from 1980, which, in my opinion, and a lot of others, and Spielberg himself, is really inferior. I still think the theatrical cut is the best version of the 3 that are available. But if you go to the box version, it has some nice special features, but the way it's programmed really is difficult for most players to handle, and it's very hard to kind of get used to, because it's really a mixture of the theatrical version and the special edition. And the idea was that you could program your remote to play the appropriate chapter selections to give you the correct scenes of which version you wanted to watch for each side. And then if I'm remembering correctly, it's the theatrical version program for each side, and then at the end of each side, in extra chapters, are the scenes that would be in the special edition. So the idea was that for each side, you could program your remote to then either play the theatrical version as encoded or play the special edition by just substituting those in. And that's really kind of a hassle, and it works on some players, and it's kind of really confusing to explain to a lot of people, and it's really confusing when you try to play it yourself. But it was a really great transfer for the time. It's like the first major release of the film in widescreen, which is a must. This film is absolutely horrible pan and scanned. And it had a really nice Dolby Matrixed version of the film's audio, which was, of course, legendary for its deep bass and dynamics in the 70mm Dolby runs back in '77. In fact, those were so well renowned that a lot of people were kind of upset when the 1980 special edition came out that the sound had been remixed and that it wasn't as deep or impactful as the 1977 version. Of course, regular theaters seeing the 35mm version would have gotten a Dolby stereo track, and that's pretty much what is replicated on this release. Now, the CLV is interesting here because it's just the theatrical cut. So this is technically the first time that the theatrical version was presented in its entirety without the issues of the special edition versions and the programming issues and such here, so you didn't have to worry about that. So if you want the Criterion version of the theatrical cut, but you don't want to deal with those problems, you can pick this up for much less and just watch the film straight through. Of course, you don't get the special features, but you do get a nice essay. You get the same lovely Dolby Surround encoded soundtrack, which sounds wonderful even compared to the modern lossless encodings. The only thing to note is that this version is the theatrical cut, except for one shot that Spielberg himself insisted that they insert from the special edition. It's the shot where there's a when Roy's driving his truck, and there's a shot from the special edition that was inserted that shows the shadow of what is essentially the alien craft passing overhead at night. That was not in the 1977 theatrical version, and that has been inserted into the Criterion version. So it's the theatrical cut except for one shot. And the soundtrack was mastered from the special edition negative, special edition negative audio source. So it's right from that master. So I guess they had to reconform it to the '77 theatrical version somehow. But it's a really nice looking disc. Of course, it's going to be a bit softer than the special edition widescreen version Columbia put out later, and then the director's cut that they put out at the very end of the format, which looks great, but that's a release from 1998. It's not going to compare to a old Criterion from '89, '90. But all that aside, the color's really nice. And, you know, it's a tad soft, but the film itself was a tad soft due to the photography style and the production scheduling. So that's kind of intentional. But it's still just a wonderful disc. It's a great way to rewatch the film. I'd highly recommend it, even if you aren't able to pick up the CAV box. And unlike the Columbia Special Edition disc, it doesn't have any rot issues, like as that one does. So it's just a lovely release, and it's a nice alternative if you can't pick up the box version or if you don't want to deal with the hassles of the way that version was encoded.